Hey, everybody, and welcome back. This is Jason, the creator and the guy you've signed on your time to listen to here on the Historic Movies podcast. You know, here on the pod, we often talk about, or I guess every week, we talk about movies and the history behind movies and what they mean and so forth. But this week, we have something special for you. We really wanted to get into the production of movies, the thoughts and philosophy and the actual craft of movie making this week. And so we invited on Justin Rawlins onto the podcast. Now, if you don't know Justin, you really should. He is an assistant professor of media studies and film studies at the University of Tulsa, which means that I am way outside my comfort zone. I am way overwhelmed by this guy talking to him today. He's just this fountain of knowledge. And he really wanted to come to me. He actually came to me asking me to do some talks about method actors and the art behind method acting and what people think about method acting. And the movie he chose to do was 1982's Tootsie. You know, the film with Dustin Hoffman and Jessica Lange and a host of other folks, and directed by Sydney Pollack, one of my absolute favorite directors. So we're going to keep this intro short for you today. I freaking love this conversation, man. Justin is such a smart and brilliant guy, and he's got so many awesome thoughts on this film. And we talk about not only this movie, but a bunch of other films that get made. And of course, what this movie is trying to say both inside the movie and also how it's being marketed and its effect on movies that we see coming out of the 1980s into the 1990s and all the way into today. So I hope you are ready for a really awesome podcast. This conversation went for a long time, and it was just a blast to sit down and talk to Justin, man, because he is such a wealth of information. I think you guys are going to absolutely dig this pod. I'm recording this intro a few days afterwards, and I'm still just over the moon delighted knowing what you guys are about to hear. So that said, sit back and relax, because Tootsie is next on the Historians of the Movies podcast. Justin Rawlins, what's going on, man? How are you?
I'm good, Jason. How are you doing?
I am talking to you across an ocean of space and time, but actually mostly just plateau, because I'm now in Pueblo, Colorado, and you're in Tulsa, right?
Yep, scenic Tulsa, Oklahoma, the Paris of northeastern Oklahoma.
Yes. Okay, so I have a Tulsa story.
Oh, please share.
So I lived for 5 years in Wichita, Kansas, which would be the Prague of the Midwest of the plains.
That's definitely how we characterize it.
Right. Clearly, because the Arkansas River, which they pronounce as the Arkansas, by the way, in the great state of Kansas. I know. Actually, and our producer Fletcher is from the great city of Wichita, and he's laughing at me right now, but it's just like going over the Vltava River. There's that much culture, and yeah, absolutely, the land of formerly of Sam Brownback over there. But okay, so my Tulsa experience.
Yes,
they've had on a couple occasions the Bassmaster Classic, which I would travel from Wichita to Tulsa to be a spectator at the World Bass Fishing Championships. Yeah, they're actually there. Actually, my mom in 2011 won the women's world bass fishing title. Yeah.
Wow.
It's crazy. Like, my whole people are like, we're like fisher people from Kentucky.
Yeah.
So we have a story of a magical catfish.
Okay, so this is catfish related, but this is not conventional fishing. Are you familiar with the practice of noodling?
Yes, absolutely. My father did it.
Oh, okay. So have you seen?
No.
yeah. Well, I did an event last year with a documentary filmmaker, amazing guy, super cool guy named Bradley Beasley, and he made a documentary about the noodling tradition in Oklahoma, and he was so cool, and it was a learning experience for me coming from Indiana. I think noodling I don't think it's legal there, but I just hadn't heard of it before. So like watching this amazing film, I went out for drinks afterwards with him and some of his friends. And it turns out they were talking a lot about the flaming lips. And I was like, okay, what's the relationship here? I didn't realize he's also like the filmmaker for the Flaming Lips. Like they've known each other since way back in the day in like the OKC area. And so it's like noodling, Flaming Lips. It's just like, what a amazing combination. I learned so much. About Oklahoma culture. It was really
should we
cool.
talk about noodling real fast, because this isn't where I expected to go, but let's do this. Like, for our listeners who have never learned how to noodle, somewhere out there there's like an Italian listener, like we're big in Sicily, they're like, oh, what are you talking about? But like, do you want to explain to our listeners what it is for one to noodle a catfish?
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to preface this by saying that I'm a child of Indiana. I'm a Hoosier, so I don't.
We're going to have to address that as well, but go on.
So, I hope folks don't come for me if and when I screw up my description of noodling. But as I understand it, the basic idea is that like you are going into like creek beds and you're feeling around for holes, presumably where catfish are residing. And you are basically using your fist as the kind of the bait. And then when they bite down, and they bite down hard, like they are not, catfish are not messing around, then you basically, I think there are some, you can have some implements to try to like help kind of wrangle it. But the idea is that like, then you pull it up with its mouth, with your arm, pretty deep into its gullet. And I in the course of doing this event, I also met an influencer who is a noodler, and just like now seeing on social media all the pictures, it's incredible. Like just the size of these suckers that they are pulling up out of, what look like pretty, to you and me, like pretty small, half dried up riverbeds. It's incredible. Do you think I did a fair?
Yeah, I mean, so, there's obviously some dangers there because you often have to put your whole body into the water, so you're often having to hold your breath as you're feeling underneath like these logs or submerged rocks or things like that. Oftentimes, it's a very specific species of catfish called a flathead catfish, which is kind of a larger yellow color, and yeah, you're waiting for it to bite down on your hand. And then once they do, they have a tremendous amount of power and can torque your arms. People often get hurt by this. I mean, it's not uncommon for people to have broken hands or arms even from the sheer power, because once these things move on, they don't want to be pulled out of their hiding hole. And of course, there's also the problem is that sometimes, and this is where you get like the pictures of these guys come out with like a finger, sometimes they put their hands in a turtle's mouth and then lose a finger or two. And you hear about that. Some people want to make fun of this. I actually have the highest regard for this, and I'm not kidding. And the reason why, this is a very salt of the earth kind of a thing. Yeah. My family, for people who know, like generations of catfishermen in my family, you and I were talking just before we started, we actually have a story that I told at my grandfather's eulogy about this catfish in the family named Ekenhammer. Also, this huge magical catfish in the Tennessee River that we don't have time to go into now. But yeah, it's a thing. Now I got to ask you the other thing. What part of Indiana?
So I'm from southern Indiana. I grew up just outside of Bloomington.
Okay, because my dad's from Evansville.
Okay, yeah, I'm a little bit further north of that, but not too far. But yeah. You're a Kentuckian, yeah?
I am, and that's why we have to end the podcast, so we can like throw things at one another from afar.
No, I got a quick Kentucky story for you.
Okay, go ahead.
I genuinely love Kentucky. Growing up as an IU basketball fan, I hated Kentucky, but that's because we had a quote unquote
I also hate you.
We had a quote unquote rivalry wherein IU always lost. So I stopped getting angry once I realized it's not really much of a rivalry if one team. It's like the Colts and the Patriots. It's not a rivalry if one team always wins.
Yes.
But anyway, I took my in-laws who are Canadian down to bourbon country, and we went to they had seen some diner on in Frankfurt on an episode of Diners, Drive-Ins and Dives.
Yeah, sure. Did they get burgoo?
Well, here's the thing. The food was wonderful. We loved the food, but my bless their hearts, my in-laws are Canadian to their core, and so they're super friendly. They talk to everyone. I'm like, guys, we get, don't just talk to strangers, especially in Kentucky, right? That's my Hoosier bias, right? So we go into this diner, and the guy is so nice, and he's asking where we're from, and my in-laws are like, "Oh, we're from Toronto," and he's like, "Oh, that's great." And then they said, before I could stop them, they said, "Yeah, Justin here's from Indiana," and the smile vanished instantly from the man's face, and he just said, "Oh,
yeah."
He was like, "Oh, you're from Toronto. That's great." And he's like, "Oh, you're from Indiana."
Any other state.
I was like, you guys, you gotta understand. In the U.S., we love rivalries. We love to hate our neighbors. We talk so much shit in Indiana about Illinois, Ohio, and Kentucky, and they do the same to us. Like that is just that is in our DNA as Americans, is that we cannot get along. We have to hate our neighbor. That's just how it is.
I'll tell you two quick stories. One of my absolute best friends in the world lives in Evansville. She's like my younger sister, and she's married to a native Kentuckian. And his family, when they come to visit, will not cross the Ohio River into Indiana. They will not do it. So when they told me that, I was like, oh my God, I immediately became like besties with her husband as well, because like, oh, we're the same people.
Yeah.
And then, I'm kind of famous. Like there's only one film that HATM on Sunday nights will not do. And that's Hoosiers. I will not. I have never seen Hoosiers. I will not, under any circumstances, give glory to Indiana basketball in any shape, form, or function whatsoever. I grew up. I was born in '77, so like my earliest memories of Kentucky basketball are of like Kenny Walker and Melvin Turpin and all these guys, and of course, complementing that or opposite that is Bobby frickin' Knight, right, in Indiana.
Yeah.
And who I am trained to hate with a fiery passion. And then, of course, it's like, I'd go to my dad's house. My dad was in Kentucky, but happened to be born in Evansville. So there's all this kind of weird. So yeah. Anyway, I actually said I will do Hoosiers on this podcast if I can get Rex Chapman on to do the podcast with me. I messaged him the other day because he follows me. I'm like, if Rex Chapman will come on this podcast, I will watch Hoosiers. He and I will talk shit about Indiana.
Okay. I will say this. I love the movie Hoosiers. It was filmed in and around where I grew up, so I know some of those sites. I love the fact that they got Gene Hackman in that movie. Dennis Hopper is wasted, but the thing I cannot. I think I rewatched it a couple of years ago, and I got Xenia to watch it, and her reaction was the same as mine, which is this soundtrack just does not work. It's like a synth soundtrack for a movie set in like the 40s or something. It does not. It really takes you out of it, which is unfortunate because Gene Hackman is so damn good in that movie. He is so good. And it's
is Hackman a method actor? Because we'll get into this later on, but
yeah.
Hackman's great and everything.
But Hoosiers, I mean, I can understand that. So have you watched Rudy?
Okay, so I have one of my also very good friends, Elizabeth Vendito, went to Minnesota a few years ahead of me, and she did her undergrad at Notre Dame, and we have come to détente to state that Notre Dame exists with outside or. It's like the Vatican inside of Indiana. It is both inside and not part of the state of Indiana. So we can do Rudy. In fact, I've kind of got promises to do Rudy on HATM and on the pod at some point in time. So that's my statement on Notre Dame in general. It's like Notre Dame kind of exists in its own weird place.
I mean, I laugh, but I would agree with that. I mean, I honestly, until I was probably 12 or 13, I didn't know that Notre Dame was located in Indiana, because it's just always talked about as kind of an isolated. It's always talked about kind of as this isolated institution that exists outside of space, right? And it prides itself on that. So maybe I'll get a lot of flack from my friends from South Bend, for whom Notre Dame is kind of this monolithic thing, but yeah, growing up in Southern Indiana, I had no idea Notre Dame was for a long time.
And tremendous schools in Indiana, right? Like, so there are awesome schools, like, as much as I hate to say it, Indiana University, terrific school, right? Notre Dame, obviously. University of Southern Indiana, University of Evansville, all these places are terrific schools. But because they're in Indiana, I would gladly switch them for any other country, including North Korea. I got
Yeah.
one last tangent here. My low key favorite basketball film, Teen Wolf.
Really?
Give me Teen. Oh yeah, give me Teen. The end, the win, the you get the montage at the end. Teen Wolf, the whole win in the end thing. It's much better music than what you get in Hoosiers. Apparently. Again,
it has to be.
seen.
Well, I mean, look, the bar is incredibly low. It's just I don't and I don't remember who the artist is, but it gives very strong like Vangelis vibes. It just doesn't work.
Have you seen Breaking Away?
Well, this is going to be the last thing I was going to mention is that there is the holy trinity of Indiana sports movies, and it's Rudy, Hoosiers, and Breaking Away. And I love Breaking Away, and Breaking Away more than those other things really captures the town gown tension,
really
which I mean, I haven't been a student at IU in a long time, but when I was there, that still very much existed. And I think it's probably gotten even worse as there's been a widening economic gap because that part of Indiana is pretty poor by and large, but IU attracts a lot of wealth from around the country and around the world. So there's still that. Last time I was there was still that palpable tension. But I love that movie.
I do too. I think it's fantastic. It's one of those things where even I have to drop my anti-Hoosier State bias and be like, Breaking Away is just good, and it's I think it holds up really, really well. You can still go back and watch it now and enjoy it. Dennis Quaid, a young Dennis Quaid, is terrific, but he's great in everything.
Yeah. I knew you secretly loved Indiana. I know.
Let's not go that far. No. I just said I would trade Indiana for North Korea, right? So, I don't know what part of like Indiana we would consider Pyongyang, but there's some part there. I got to ask you a question though. You're drinking, what is it? Is that hot tea tonight? What are you rocking?
Hot tea, yeah. I mean, I know it's 100 degrees outside right now, but it is like a meat locker in my office. And I initially was going to I had like a poofy coat I have to wear because it's so cold, but I thought that might like make too many swishing sounds. So I'm just mainlining Earl Grey tea, and I also am perpetually sleep deprived. You've been through this. You have kids. I've got a 2-year-old, and so it's just some days you feel like a bit of a zombie.
What's harder? It's like I've got this puppy.
Oh, yeah.
He's like 6.5 months old, and when I had kids, it was actually easier because I would say things like, "Honey, you go be the parent, the responsible parent, and it's important for one of us to get sleep, so I will do that." This might explain why I'm also a divorced man. So, Christine, if you're listening, I think you may have been right, but it's so much work to have a dog. I had forgotten about this. It's a lot, and he's right here next to me, and I'm just like, please be quiet so we can record, and then we can go to the DOGPARK tomorrow, because if I say it out loud, he bails for the door. So he's ready.
Is it getting easier though? Like at this like at 6 months, I haven't had a dog since I was a kid, so I'm kind of
I haven't had a dog in ages. Yes and no. I had done a really good job training him, and he was getting really good when we were in Florida. And then the move to Colorado was kind of regressed him. He was peeing in the floor. I was peeing in the floor. Everything was just a mess. Nobody knew where we were going. So we're trying to find some equilibrium.
Yeah. You'll get there. You'll get there, right?
Eventually. All right, speaking of getting there, maybe we should talk about this movie tonight. So we've been trying to do this pod for months and months and months, and our schedules just kept getting off and aligned and blah, blah, blah. And you wanted to do Tootsie on this film and talk a lot about method acting and things like that. Maybe I'm putting words in your mouth. Why Tootsie? Why this particular movie? I said any movie you want to do, and you said this film from 1982, Dustin Hoffman. Why this one?
I can answer that question on a couple of different levels. One, this is a movie that I talk about. I devote, I would say, half of a chapter to in my upcoming book, because I think it's an interesting glimpse into the thesis of my book. Really, is that we have been so absorbed in trying to figure out what method acting is that we actually haven't paid attention to the fact that we have kind of imagined a version of method acting that has far outpaced the actual theories, philosophies, practices. And so I was interested in like, well, what's the imagined idea of method acting? And I remembered back to watching Tootsie as a kid. I think, we are both of the same generation, and, Tootsie was one of those quintessential 80s kind of adult comedies. And I remembered back to the basic plot of the film, which is about a really neurotic New York actor who is so absorbed in his own process that he's impossible to work with, right? And I thought, oh my God, he's playing a method actor. Like, he's playing the idea of a method actor. He's just impossible, and he is so strident in his beliefs about what acting has to be, that he's just insufferable, right? There's that great line in the film where Michael Dorsey, Dustin Hoffman's character, is talking to George Fields, Sydney Pollack's character. And of course, Pollack is not only supporting actor, but also the director. Shout out Indiana.
God, I love Sydney Pollack.
Sydney Pollack. He's from Indiana.
Are you shitting me?
I'm
wow.
Not shitting you. Yep.
Oh, yeah. God. All right.
Yeah.
I love him and Michael Clayton.
He's so good. He is so good. Right. So, and someone who is part of the broader tradition that we often call method acting. He studied at the neighborhood playhouse with Sanford Meisner, who's part of that tradition, but they're not technically method actors. But that's a whole other thing we can talk about. But like, I remembered this, and so I went back and I watched it and I rewatched it, and I thought, oh my God, this movie is built around an assumption that the audience knows what a method actor is, to the point where they don't even mention method. Isn't mentioned once in this movie. It's not mentioned once, but the whole film is built around the assumption that you know what that person is, and that he is super obnoxious and insufferable, and yet he's really good at what he does, so much so that he fakes everyone out, right? And in the end, the film is like, it's been mocking him mercilessly for the first half. And the second half, it's like, yeah, but but it's all legit, and he's really great. And, he's so great that he even makes himself a better person, right? And so I was like, that's really interesting to me, that I think that is kind of where we are at with an entrenched idea of what method acting is. It's so embedded now. This isn't the 1950s where we're talking about method all the time. It comes up occasionally, usually around Jared Leto being obnoxious, and people saying, or someone losing a lot of weight or gain a lot of weight, and they say, oh, they've gone too far, they've gone method, right?
The Christian Bales, right?
Yeah, Christian Bale, right, doing all of that. Actually, I saw during the NCAA tournament 2 adverts that played on this. One was Candace Parker dribbling basketballs. And this kid, the parents are like, oh, that's strange. And the kid was like, oh, she's a method. That's her method performance. And then another one with Rosario Dawson pretending to be a robo service caller in AT&T. And she said, I'm method. That's what I do. And I was like, my God, this is wild. But generally speaking, we don't really use the word so much anymore. We talk about extreme commitment and devotion and staying in character and bad behavior on set and all that stuff. And to me, that's like, oh, there's this simultaneous thing happening with the way that we kind of understand or imagine method acting and method actors in the present, where we simultaneously revile them, but also revere them. So for every Jared Leto, we have a Daniel Day-Lewis, right? And we don't just praise them, but like they get industrial plaudits as well, right? So I was thinking about that. I was also thinking about the fact that I just love this movie. I really enjoy it. It has a lot of problems, but it's just such a murderer's row of supporting actors. Like, I just can't.
Oh my God. Can we get into that?
Yes, please. I mean, and many of them themselves are part of this broader thing, this broader world of method acting. Like Terry Garr studied at the Actors Studio. She's a method actor. Jessica Lange studied with Uta Hagen, who is kind of tangentially part of this world. Dabney Coleman studied the Neighborhood Playhouse. Like these folks, it's a stacked cast. Like, they're so good. Bill Murray isn't even credited in this movie.
No,
and his character,
I didn't even know he was in it till I watched it last night.
Yeah. And his character and Terry Garr's character, they were written by Elaine May, like the great Elaine May, the comedian, writer, director. She came in and helped out on the production, and basically she created the Bill Murray character, and then she rewrote the Terry Garr character to make her more, I think, multidimensional. But like, I love Terry Garr. Terry Garr was my first crush. I loved her, and I grew up watching her in Tootsie and Mr. Mom, and she's just such an incredibly talented performer. And for me, one of the things that makes a really convincing performance is when, like, we know that acting is hard, right? If you know anything about acting, you know that it's incredibly difficult. Anyone could in theory do it, but just the headspace you have to be in, the command of your instrument that you have to do it is really hard. So when someone acts in a way that just makes it look easy, like Terry Garr makes acting look easy. Dabney Coleman makes you think that he's a prick, right? He's just an incredible, incredible actor. He's really good at doing that. Jessica Lange can play vulnerable so well. She's just a tremendous actor, right? Bill Murray, like all the deadpan stuff that he does in this movie, like when he's at the party at the opening and he's talking like, I don't want a full house coming to my play. I don't want people coming up and saying, I like your message. I want people coming up and asking, what was that? Right? I mean, like that's just like, I love Bill Murray deadpan. And for me, this film is like kind of right up there in the pantheon of great deadpan Bill Murray performances.
So let's talk about Bill Murray for a second, because I had read on IMDb they purposely left him off the cast off the billing because they didn't want people going in thinking this was a Bill Murray movie or thinking this was Bill Murray, like they'd already seen him on a couple of the things. And frankly, I had never seen Bill Murray like this. Bill Murray's kind of playing almost like the straight man to Hoffman.
Yeah, I know, right?
And I kept watching. I was like, oh my gosh, I wonder what Bill Murray's career looks like if he doesn't lean into the goofy, kind of charming kind of guy, because he's charming in this, but very much the straight guy who's just kind of giving these very deadpan deliveries, but is otherwise kind of watching and going, what's going on here? I thought he was terrific.
I mean, he's playing a failed playwright who's writing a play about people returning to Love Canal, right?
Yeah.
And I can see. I love the way you phrase that, Jason, because I think that there would be an interesting exercise in kind of drawing connective tissue between like a really kind of understated performance like his role as Jeff in Tootsie, and then like his work in the 2000s, like his kind of dramatic turn, right? His Wes Anderson stuff where he tends to be more restrained, right? I think there's some interesting maybe previews of what when we start to get into more substantive leading man stuff, but stuff that's still understated, like the zaniness is taken out of it, right? When he's playing, gosh, I think all the roles I can think of in his Wes Anderson films seem like they might have had germs of that kind of performance in something like Tootsie.
Yeah, and I think in some ways maybe there's these two weird derivations I go here. I see a direct line to Lost in Translation with this. I can see, because hidden within Bill Murray's acting career is the fact that he's got a real acting ability. He's a good actor. If he has someone pull it out of him, obviously Pollack can pull that out of anybody. And Sofia Coppola, who was revealed herself to be just an amazing auteur herself, pulled that out of Lost. It was like when he did Lost in Translation many years later, it was like this revelation that, holy cow, where is this version of Bill Murray been? But I think you could almost see it, in hindsight, looking at Tootsie. You're like, wow, wait a second, this has always been here. And there's this weird thing. I kept thinking for some reason, and this may be odd, thinking about Bill Murray straight man, almost thinking about Vince Vaughn in Swingers. I don't know why, because the character is radically different, but he's the pal who is kind of watching the pal, and I don't know why I'm drawing these lines, because Vaughn is manic in Swingers. He's amazing as Trent. But I don't know. There's something there. I almost feel like Vaughn's pulling something from there. I don't quite know where it comes from.
Well, I think that one of the things that you're bringing up here, and this is something that you had asked me a question earlier about in our email exchange about like what my favorite method actors films would be, and I was thinking back to one of my favorite films ever, but it's not a film that makes you think like method actor. It's not screaming method actor. It's not, like tortured, super introspective person. It's not sad man acting, right? But
it's not the pianist.
Right. Yeah, exactly. It's, it's Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. It's Paul Newman. And but for me, it's like the way that he carries himself so effortlessly in that film. He is expending so much energy, but you don't realize it. You don't realize he's acting. The way that he kind of like works with Robert Redford, it's just like that to me is a clinic in incredible acting. Like I remember that's one of the first, maybe the first Western that I ever saw. And I was like, my God, this is revelatory. Like I was probably 10 or something like that. And I knew of like John Wayne because my grandpa had all these John Wayne VHS tapes, but I was like, well, if my grandpa likes it, I love my grandpa, but like, this is something I think for older people. And then I watched Butch Cassidy, Sundance Kid, even though it was at that point, probably 20 years old. And I was just floored. I was like, I'm seeing something just mind blowing right now. Like I can't even process that. And I've come back to that a couple of times. And I think that's because of what Paul Newman, and also Robert Redford. But for me, Paul Newman is just so damn electric and effortless when he's doing something that we know is extremely hard. It's hard to be charming on screen. It's hard to make that kind of work look effortless. Like it's remarkable. So like for me, someone like Bill Murray, who's not, he's not part of the method tradition, but one of the reasons I'm really attracted to this role for him is that he's doing a lot, but he doesn't make it look like he's doing a lot. He makes it actually look it almost feels like he's improvising, but he's not. And that's improvising. I say that like in a good way, not like he's not falling all over his words or anything like that.
It's smooth.
It's so smooth. And it's just such an expert cast. And I know that, Sydney Pollack, he was a trained actor, right? Hated being an actor, but he then went on to teach directing the Neighborhood Playhouse, and he's phenomenal with actors. And there's a reason actors loved working with Sydney Pollack. So I feel like it's one of those things. Originally, Tootsie was going to be it was in development for years, and originally it was going to be Dustin Hoffman and Hal Ashby. Hal Ashby was going to be the director, and I think it would have been a much more adventurous film. Like I think it would have taken more chances. Like in many ways, Tootsie is very kind of by the books, even as it's incredible in many respects. But I think with someone like Sydney Pollack, I think the studios knew like you're getting someone who's really good with actors, who's good at like, bringing films in on time and on budget, right? Like he's a professional, but he knows his craft so well, and he knows the craft of acting so well that he can elicit those performances out of already talented people. But, to have that working dynamic between your director and your actors is like, that doesn't happen that often.
No, and every story I've actually read about Sydney Pollack acting is that he has to be like almost dragged onto set to be in the film because he's just so damn. I mean, one of my favorite films of all time is Jeremiah Johnson, which he helms, and it's I mean, in my mind, just goes toe to toe with John Ford or any other classic.
Yeah,
this. You could film Jeremiah Johnson with no dialogue whatsoever and just allow Pollack to frame that film. It's insanely beautiful. I just love his work, and like I said earlier, I'm dying to do Michael Clayton on this pod at some point in time.
Yeah,
he's a smaller part in that, but he's electric every time he's on screen. He's just great. He's just absolutely terrific. But I want to talk to you actually. One of the things that big you're talking about the. If Ashby had done the film versus say Pollack done, and maybe some of the chances they maybe don't take. One of the recurring things that comes along, and I look at this as a historical artifact, is these questions over sexuality. And there is a real, and I don't know if this is where they don't take the chances or what, because it's clearly they're playing around these ideas like, okay, here's a quote unquote straight man dressing as a woman. Are you gay?
Yeah.
Are you gay? And these questions, it's in the flirting around with these ideas of sexuality. And I kind of wonder, is that it's a hallmark of the early 80s where they're kind of pulling back? knowing this was a massive hit for the studio.
Mm-hmm.
What's going on here? What are the conversations going around sexuality, say in the early '80s, on these films? Say a film, starring a large bankable star, like Hoffman.
Yeah.
What are we getting out of here?
Well, and I mean, I think that's a really important question. And one of the things that jumps out at me, and I think actually the image that you the poster, Tootsie, that you put up when you were mentioning the upcoming slate, it has this tagline, which I've seen in a number of the promotional materials, which is it characterizes Hoffman's character as hopelessly straight. And to me, that's really emblematic of what's happening, how this film is trying to have its cake and eat it too. It's trying to engage with this kind of gender swap movie trope, right? Which is not, it's not the first film to do that. There have been several before and quite a few since. But there's something about it, and I almost wonder if this is maybe a worry about kind of the ascribed power that people gave to method acting, that like, what if he is so good at becoming a woman that he decides he actually likes his life more, right?
Right, yeah.
Or that he is like, I sense that there may have been some concern on the part of the filmmakers, like, we have to really insist, like, to the point where it's, I mean, at least to my eyes, as someone revisiting this in the 21st century, I'm like, this is, they're really straining here to emphasize his heterosexuality. But I think that's a way of hedging the fact that the film is also ascribing him such a powerful ability to perform and to inhabit a body, that like, what if, maybe the concern is, what if he becomes a woman? Because there is that line at the end where he tells Jessica Lange's character, and it's very convoluted, and in the making of documentary, they talk about how it was so hard for him to get this verbiage down. But the gist of it was that he became a better man by being a woman around her than he was by like being a man around her, right? That's the gist of it. But there is this, I feel like there's this insistence in the movie that like they're trying to parse out him performing as a woman and any questions about his gender identity or sexual orientation. You know what I mean? I mean, one of the things that gives me pause, and I'm not sure how this would have played in the early 80s, but watching it decades later, there's the scene where the George Gaines character, the kind of aging star who's taken a liking to Dorothy, he tries to rape her, right? Like in her apartment. And, Bill Murray's character kind of makes light of it, right? And you think about kind of that against the backdrop of just what we know about how serious and how pervasive like sexual violence against trans people is, like, to see like that within the context of that knowledge, it gives me pause, right? The way it's kind of flippant about the violence that people who engage in like cross-dressing or people who don't conform to our kind of binaristic notions of gender presentation, that it's just kind of like, oh, isn't that, like, oh, were you asking for it? That kind of thing. It's like,
it's played for laughs. It's
played for laughs. And maybe amongst, the kind of general audience of the early 80s, maybe that landed, right? It lands. I mean, I think we would all agree it lands very differently in a present context, right? But to your question, there is something about the links to which they go to emphasize that his performance is one thing, and it's very convincing, and it makes him a better person, but it doesn't change his sexuality or his gender identity. And I think if this movie was remade in 2023, I would hope filmmakers wouldn't work so hard to try to make that distinction. Like, I think there's room for play there that could make for a really compelling story, a really interesting story. I will add that Dustin Hoffman did a lot of press in the months leading up to Tootsie's release in 82 and 83. And he really emphasized that, like, getting into this character made him, he said that he learned what it was like to be a woman by playing this part, right? And he understood the plight of women by playing this role. and that made him a better man. So he's kind of taken that sensibility that his character professes, and at least up through the 20 teens, he was doing interviews about Tootsie and articulating the same thing. And to the extent that he actually starts crying and talking about how it was transformative for him. So that's really interesting. It's also interesting that that's happening while the producers are saying like, no, don't worry, he's straight, right?
Yeah.
So there's that. And I mean, we can't divorce that from the kind of the culture of homophobia in the 1980s, right? But again, it's like this is happening, and this is a massive hit. This is the second highest grossing film of 1982. And, it's a film that engages in gender play, like during the Reagan era, right? Like there are all kinds of transgressive possibilities. I think they're aware of some of them because they're trying to like kind of rein them in ahead of time, but that doesn't guarantee that that's how everyone's going to read them, right? Like it doesn't, people are still going to read them in different ways, and maybe it makes possible certain readings that the producers can't foreclose. They can't shut those down.
This gets into some larger questions that are kind of ongoing, maybe have been ongoing for a while, but I have only become aware of them in the last few years as I've kind of dived more and more into this interest of pop culture, which is the questions of representation. And you were talking about how Hoffman says, hey, my experiences in this film helped me to understand what it's like to be a woman much more. And we talked about Leto earlier, particularly for his in Dallas Buyers Club, I think. More specifically to this role, about the idea of when we get into film production and representation. Now we're talking about these questions of if the on-screen character is gay or non-binary or something like that. Who should be playing these roles? Who can be played? Is there a question? And we can go across racial lines and things like that. Maybe more famously, I think the character by Tilda Swinton playing in the Marvel films is not.
Oh yeah, the ancient one. Yeah.
The ancient one, right?
Yep.
So these questions are kind of. I think as maybe a global audience, are still trying to understand ourselves and what we're comfortable with. Are these things? What kind of questions are going on inside of method acting as well? I guess might be my question. Yeah. Can people take on these roles? I mean, what's your experience as far as seeing these questions in dialogue in film right now?
So I'll tell you a story about what got me into this. What led to this book actually was this very question, and so it's actually based in a movie starring John Wayne. So I'm in a graduate seminar. And I hear about a movie he does where he plays Genghis Khan, right? And I'm like, okay, that can't be real. That's too preposterous. John Wayne, like Mr. White Masculinity, like there's no way it's going to happen. So I watched it, and obviously it's real. It happened. It was a disaster, not just in terms of like the story, but like they literally filmed it in downwind of an atomic test site. And so it's in like a canyon. So you have all this irradiated dirt that these cast and crew are just inhaling for months and months and months.
Wow. Yeah,
you can look somewhere and there's a picture of John Wayne with a Geiger counter, and it's like, registering radiation, right? As if that wasn't bad enough, then they shipped tons of that radioactive dirt back to Culver City for reshoots and interior shoots because they wanted the color of the sand to match. So many people involved in this film die of cancer within 20 years. And we still don't know, because of the long and sordid history of atomic testing and indigenous people, there were a lot of indigenous people hired as extras to play Mongol warriors. And so I don't think any authority has taken the time to actually calculate the destruction and damage to those communities. So in the aftermath of this, one of the persistent critiques of this movie is that John Wayne was miscast. Okay, I think that seems fairly obvious. But a number of these people come back and say, you know what, Marlon Brando would have been much better for this role. And I thought to myself, why? And of course, there's a long history of like white actors doing yellowface, right? But
Mickey
what
Rooney,
is it?
So I don't think about
oh my
right?
God, yes, Mickey Rooney. Yeah. And in some cases, these are like rewarded. There was a movie called The Good Earth where the lead actors, I think it was about the plight of, I want to say, Chinese peasants. And the lead actors were all white actors in yellowface. And the lead woman, Louise Rainier, actually won an Oscar for that performance. You can look it up on YouTube. It's not, yeah, it's something. But so I was curious about, like, what is it about the assumptions being made about acting and one's capacity to inhabit other subjectivities that's informing this preference for Brando? Because apparently Brando had been offered the role, but very smartly was like, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to do the Conqueror. So that led me to kind of looking into all the discourse around performances and who is given the leeway to inhabit other subjectivities, and where are those boundaries drawn. And one of the things that I keep coming back to, even into the present, is that one of the things that this imagining of method acting does is it affords white guys an incredible amount of lenience in terms of taking on the roles of like racial others, disabled others, right? Like, think about someone like Daniel Day-Lewis in My Left Foot, right? Like he is an able-bodied performer. He is portraying a real life person with disabilities, right? He was praised for that, right? And there have been numerous examples of this happening elsewhere. That kind of freedom or allowance is usually not made for women, and is almost never made for people of color. You think about, like, Denzel Washington is one of the greatest actors ever. We don't see him being given the kind of leeway to like portray characters that we get with someone like Daniel Day-Lewis, who is in many ways, a peer. So there's that kind of allowance. The question of representation, I think I'm so glad you asked this, Jason, because it's such an important question. It's something that film and media scholars have really been wrestling with for a long time, because I think that there's a number of levels on which representation is operating, not only in front of the camera, but also like in the writing of characters. Like who's in the writer's room, right? Who's the screenwriter? Who are the producers and studio heads who are greenlighting some projects featuring certain characters and not other projects featuring other characters? Who's directing? Who's casting, right? Who's in charge of casting? What's the logic of casting here? And so thinking through what are all the different streams that feed into what ends up being like the representation is this question that many of my colleagues in film and media studies have been wrestling with for a while. And thinking about as well, like the other end of the equation, like, well, what happens when a particular representation is out in the world? What do people do with that? What do audiences make of that? Do they read it in ways that go against the expectations of producers or against the way that it's advertised? Are there ways in which people can engage in like counter readings, or people can appropriate particular interpretation? James Dean, for example, was in the 50s marketed as like, a teen rebel heartthrob, right? But he has really been taken on as well as a queer icon. I went to the James Dean Festival a number of years ago, and they had a James Dean lookalike contest, and I was really blown away by the like array of different kinds of people that were engaging in this like James Dean cosplay. And it was a lot of like gender play, a lot of that stuff. So, when we think about representation, I think we're trying to wrestle with like a multi-headed phenomenon. I think one of the things that often gets us caught in the kind of mainstream discourse about representation is we sometimes get caught in this binary of like, well, is it good representation or bad representation? And it's like, it's much messier than that. Because sometimes if we get caught in that binary, then we end up blaming an actor who's maybe like, this is like the only paid role they get, right? So like, trying to unpack that is really complicated. But I think method acting kind of figures in as a thing that affords some performers more leeway to kind of transgress and doesn't do the same for others. I would add, one of the interesting things that I talk about in the same chapter with Tootsie is the kind of rhetoric that emerges around women who transform their bodies for roles. So like, Nicole Kidman in various movies like Destroyer. Have you seen Destroyer?
No.
You should watch it. It's people disagree with me about whether it's a good movie or not. It's Karen Kusama. I don't know that I've seen a Karen Kusama film that I didn't really like, but it's like Nicole Kidman is really like, she looks really like beat up, like run down. She looks like a grizzled cop. And so there's that kind of like transformation she undergoes. But like someone like Charlize Theron, when she
so exactly, it's like a
when she
right?
Yeah, when she transforms for Monster, or she gains, I think it's about 40 pounds for the movie Tully. I write about Tully, and so much of the discourse around Tully is, it's like, well, when are you getting back to your like model body, right? When are you? There's a writer who called this phenomenon the make under, not the makeover, the make under, right? And so much of that rhetoric, whereas with the men, it's like, oh, what tremendous sacrifice, and you really, what you did for this role. And with the women,
when are you going to get attractive?
Yeah,
again?
Yeah, exactly.
Kind of,
it's like, okay, we'll grant you this brief deviation into ugliness, right? But we want to know, when are you going to return to a kind of, normative, like sexy body, right?
Right.
And so like Charlize Theron ends up talking as much about eating ice cream and working out as she does about like the psychology of the Tully character. And the Tully character is Charlize Theron is such an incredible actor. And like, I want to know more about her process, but like these interviews are just like, when are you going to be pretty again, Charlize? Right? Like, how long did it take you to get pretty again? That kind of thing. And it's like, man, no one's asking Christian Bale that, right? He may volunteer that like, you know what? It really sucks to like gain and lose weight. But like, people aren't like, when are you going to get pretty again? Christian.
and this goes back to, again, these ideas of what is expected of sexes, of the sex on a popular scale. And really, especially as people age, it's not a surprise that men, or it's not, maybe it should be a surprise, but I think it's pretty well known that the working time length for actors is much longer than for male actors versus female actors.
Yeah.
Tom Cruise is still making films with all the way up to Mission Impossible 75.
Yep.
But his romantic leads still, he gets older and they stay the same age.
Yes. Yeah. It's the McConaughey paradigm, right? Like, yeah. No, it's true. It's true. It's absolutely true. And there are, of course, a few exceptions, but like, Meryl Streep.
Charlize has been able to. Meryl Streep, certainly.
Yeah. Well, there was just an article. There's just an article the other day I saw, Charlize Theron. She was just basically like, stop asking me if I've had work done. It's just called getting older. I'm just aging. Like, it's stop asking me about my looks. Like, and you know what? Like, she's a veteran. She's an Oscar winner. She is incredible at what she does. She is bankable. And yet still, after 30 years in the business, she's still getting that crap, right? Like that for me is like, that's a good indicator of kind of like where things are at. So if you're like, and she has all that clout, all that leverage, and she's still getting that kind of nonsense. So, so I'm glad you asked about representation, because I think there's a lot going on. And like with something like Tootsie, like Dustin Hoffman, one of the things that he long encountered, and this is something a lot of Jewish actors encountered, was a lot of sometimes blatant anti-Semitism, sometimes inferred anti-Semitism. But one of the ways that this would manifest is that Jewish performers would be talked about as being ugly, right? Dustin Hoffman got this a lot. Like, oh, you can't play the lead in The Graduate because you're not attractive enough. You're ugly. One of my favorite performers and one of the earliest method actors is John Garfield. And like when he debuts in Four Daughters in 1938, he is the draw to that movie. But over and over again, the studio discourse, like his studio is saying, yeah, he's not a very attractive guy. And you look at him and you're like, he's totally like, what are these people talking about? But it's that long storied like tradition of calling Jewish people like ugly. It's a way of marking them as other, right? So you have that additional layer, of course, on top of everything else that's happening in Tootsie, that he's like trying to transform himself not only into a woman, but into a figure that might be considered attractive. But of course, everyone afterwards, with a few exceptions, is like, you're not very attractive.
You bring this up because a couple nights ago we did When Harry Met Sally on HTM on the Sunday night thing that we do. And one of the questions I had was, is Billy Crystal attractive? I'm always kind of fascinated with what people find attractive in either sex. Like we talk about Charlize Theron, or remember, some people will find her attractive, some people will not. Crystal is this incredibly charismatic dude. He's a Jewish man, certainly. He's with Meg Ryan, who is one of the darlings of her era, right? And then right now we find ourselves in discourse around Bradley Cooper and his upcoming portrayal of Leonard Bernstein.
Yep.
And there's recently been discourse about the prosthetic nose that he wears as part of the performance. And I think this role takes place over decades.
I think so, yeah.
And I know my very good friend David Perry had said he did not appreciate, did not like, and I'm trying to put words in David's mouth, the depiction. Other folks have said, it was fine, including Bernstein's. I think children had come out and said, hey, that had a big, beautiful nose, and we're okay with it, right? Mm-hmm. But when you tie it into these questions over depictions of Jewish people on screen, it gets
messier, right? It gets real messy. What is that representation? Like, it doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? So like we can't, even if his children are like, yeah, we're fine with it, it's still part of a long history of characterizing
Jewish people in a certain way, right?
Exactly.
Absolutely.
Exactly.
Yeah. In a way that has often been derogatory or used to dehumanize people of Jewish descent.
Yep.
So I understand why that would be problematic.
Yeah. Yeah. Now I wonder, I don't talk about this film, but I do wonder about like Dustin Hoffman in the movie Hook, because he plays Captain Hook, and he's in a lot of, if I remember correctly, a lot of questionable prosthetics. So that might be something I look at someday, like kind of in the context of this, the kinds of conversations that have been reinvigorated over the Maestro nose prosthetic.
The amazing thing is I forget he's in Hook, and he is literally Hook.
Yeah.
And it kind of gets to the fact that there are so many actors, and I was talking about this last night with a very good friend of mine about how there are some actors, say like Tom Cruise, who on almost every single role, I was actually talking to Thomas Lecoq about this. Tom, you watch Tom Cruise. I know I'm watching Tom Cruise in a movie.
Yeah.
Except for maybe I can think of one film where he disappears, and that's in Collateral, where I forget I'm watching Tom Cruise.
Oh yeah,
because he takes on that.
He's so good. He's so good in that role.
So good in Collateral.
He's so good at playing a bad guy. The War of the Worlds.
You wish he would do it more often.
Yes, The War of the Worlds. I'm not a fan of the movie, but him playing a shitty dad, I'm like, that he's really good in that role. That's not a personal judgment on him as a person, but it's like in that role, like him playing like the really fed up, impatient, immature father figure.
Human.
It brings dimensionality to his character. Collateral, such a great example. And what's the other one that I was thinking of?
Edge of Tomorrow.
Edge of Tomorrow, where he starts off as a coward. He's a coward.
He is great in Edge of Tomorrow.
He is a gutless coward to start that movie, and he becomes like you watch him transform into a selfless hero, and it's like, oh my god, we need more of that, right? We get that in Magnolia a little bit. It's a bit more melodramatic in Magnolia, but like Edge of Tomorrow, that, oh my god, I love that movie. That is a movie I will watch anytime.
It's so good. It's so creative.
Yes, it's so good.
One of my great frustrations is the fact that the marketing company, because they could never figure out how to market that film, because Emily Blunt is phenomenal in that role.
Yeah.
The movie's just it's great all the way around. I'm a huge. We will come back to it. We'll do a Tom Cruise podcast at some point in time. We'll just see his career, because I would love to do that.
Yeah.
I feel like Magnolia is a bit manufactured, and going back to Newman, my first exposure to Newman was actually really Color of Money, and he and Newman are phenomenal together.
Oh wow, yeah,
he's great in Color of Money.
Yeah,
because he's a punk.
Yeah.
He's unlikable the entire movie.
He's great when he plays unlikable characters. Like he doesn't do that enough. Like, I mean, I love the Mission Impossible movies as much as the next person, but when he plays, when he plays a kind of one-dimensional hero character, I'm like, that's okay. It's fine. It's fun, but it doesn't pull me in. Like when he plays a bad person, that's where he shines. Well, okay. Another example of this actually is A Few Good Men. He starts off, he's a punk. Again, he is an arrogant punk who learns how to become a lawyer in the course of this trial. And he learns to have integrity. He learns that like, oh, principles do matter. It's not just about kind of gliding through on my privilege until I can go into private practice. It's like, this matters. And you see that transformation. And it's like, give me more of that. Like that's where his best acting chops lay,
I don't know that we've got enough appreciation for Rob Reiner as a director. And I say this because it's well known that Reiner's great, but what he pulls off, you talk about that. Obviously, Princess Bride is what I think about when I think about Reiner. But he actually directed Harry Met Sally, I think, as well.
Yep.
So he pulls these amazing performances out of people, and we don't talk about Reiner.
He has an amazing streak in the 80s. It's ridiculous. I mean, he did This Is Spinal Tap, which is, like maybe the all-time best mockumentary. Obviously, yeah, he does Princess Bride, which is like, find me a Gen Xer or a millennial who doesn't love that movie. You would be hard pressed to find that. Okay.
Can I tell you, I used to have my dating profiles on like Bumble and stuff like that. I used to list as like, they'd have the about you, and I would always say, actually, I'm the real Dread Pirate Roberts. It killed. It just killed. They're like, you know what? You're not classically handsome like Bradley Cooper, but you're funny like Billy Crystal. So,
oh man, I like that. Okay, so here we go. So the Rob Reiner 80s lineup. Okay,
right.
So he does This Is Spinal Tap. Then The Sure Thing, I'm not familiar with that one. Then Stand By Me. Then The Princess Bride. Then When Harry Met Sally. Then Misery. Then A Few Good Men. That's 8 years. He does all those films in 8 years.
The breadth of what he does in those films.
And he doesn't have, he's not one of those directors who has a distinct aesthetic, right? He's just one of those, like,
he's not Scorsese.
Yeah, or he's not Scorsese. He's not, Fincher. He's not one of these people, Wes Anderson, where you're like, okay, it's blocked a particular way and thematically it's a particular thing. In a sense, he reminds me of like some of like the really tremendous directors, unsung directors of like the classical era. Like you have someone like, Michael Curtiz, who like you look at his filmography and you're like, okay, some of these I don't recognize, but a lot of these are like, holy crap, this is incredible. And maybe there's no unifying theme or aesthetic, but like he did the work. Like that's his work, right? Like that. Yeah. Those are films that he directed. And I feel the same way about Rob Reiner. It's like he got these performances out of people across very different genres, right? And there's nothing that makes me say necessarily this is a Rob Reiner movie. But like when you see all the body of work that he's done, you're like, holy crap, like respect. Yeah. This guy is really good at his job. Like he's really good at working with actors. He's really good at working across genres. And that's, it's hard enough to make one movie, let alone to try to make different movies in different genres that can work.
And like Pollack, when you put him in front of the camera, he shows up in small bits, like in Wolf of Wall Street. He's tremendous.
Oh yeah.
He's like adrenaline into a film. He just shoots something into it that is not there ordinarily. And he's $26,000 for science. They cure cancer. Actually, they did cure. It's my first Rob Reiner impression. So I like it. Thank you. I gotta ask you. Okay, we're talking about method actors.
Yeah.
The influence of this film. Do you have favorite method actors? Off the top of your head. I mean, because Jeremy Strong is coming up a lot recently.
Oh yeah.
Off of Succession.
Yeah.
Most famously because Brian Cox is like, I don't understand what the hell he's doing. It's annoying.
He's gonna hurt himself. He needs to take it easy. Just relax. Okay, so there's an interesting Hoffman parallel here. First of all, I don't know. I don't know if Jeremy Strong is a method actor, but he has certainly been kind of roped into this method discourse, right? Just like someone like Jared Leto. I don't think Jared Leto actually does method acting, but he is certainly a part of that discourse, right?
Yeah.
But the Jeremy Strong thing and the way that Brian Cox responds, to me, is so reminiscent of the story that's come out of the movie Marathon Man. Have you done Marathon Man on this series yet?
We did Marathon Man actually on one night, on the Sunday night thing that we did, and I had never seen it before.
It's wild,
and
it's it's wild.
Yeah.
So
we got to the teeth scene.
Oh God! Tough. Oh yeah. Mm-mm.
Yeah.
No thanks.
That's tough.
So the story goes that like Hoffman is like shows up to do a scene and he's just wrecked and maybe the scene's not going so well. And Sir Laurence Olivier, classically trained, Shakespearean actor, has reached his wit's end and is like, my boy, have you ever tried just acting? Right. And that has become, it's an anecdote. I'm sure there's truth to it. It's certainly been repeated a lot, but that kind of captures that difference between like maybe the pre-existing reputation of acting is like, it's a craft that you hone, and the association with method acting, which is like, it's a thing you live. Right. I sensed that as soon as I saw the Brian Cox comments about Jeremy Strong. It's like, well, just take it easy, relax. Yeah, that's right. It's just a role. Like that, I worry about him.
You don't have to live this.
Yes, exactly. So I feel like one of the reasons that took off so much is that it tapped into a sense of like something that's been around for a while. It's also captured and expressed in the Laurence Olivier, Dustin Hoffman thing. Was Hoffman staying up late to try to inhabit that role? He says he was just out partying. So, I mean, who knows? But it certainly seems believable given what our kind of reception of Hoffman as a person who tends to inhabit his roles, that he might have, artificially deprived himself of sleep to seem like a sleep deprived person in that film.
I'm just now realizing there's a connection here because you mentioned Zinnia earlier, so I'll bring her name. Your spouse Zinnia was on the pod. The second one, also, Dustin Hoffman was in that film. And Chef.
Oh, that's right.
Just now realizing that.
I guess
we're a little bit.
We're like the president and vice president of the Dustin Hoffman fan club over here. I guess
there are worse clubs to be part of because he's phenomenal.
He's really great. Yeah,
I will tell you we've been doing HATM now for over 5 years now. I've had one night, one film where I got blowback on the film that we showed, and it was Rain Man.
Oh yeah,
I did it. There were a significant portion of autistic folks who were like, why are you showing this movie? Why are you talking about it? Blah, blah, blah. And I 100% appreciated their input and also lack of support, for lack of a better word. The fact that like, you shouldn't be watching this movie. It did a lot of damage and things like that. But I was, his portrayal of that film, was he method acting in that as like, I wonder about his preparation in that film.
That's a good question. I actually don't know. I haven't read much about Rain Man. I mean, one of the things that just, as having watched the movie a few times, I'm struck by the thing we talked about earlier where like he won an Academy Award for this performance, right? So like I would consider this in the history of people said to be method actors or characterized as method actors being given at the time enough of a pass to do this and for it to be like, celebrated at like a kind of industrial social level, and for good reason that wouldn't happen now. But I think it is a pretty vivid example of a certain allowance given to someone like Hoffman, that he could inhabit the subjectivity of a person who is on the spectrum and convey that. Now, of course, I don't think he actually can, and it's a very problematic performance. But I think that he's given that, at least at an industrial level, given that kind of leeway because he has a reputation for being a method actor.
Did you see Tropic Thunder?
Yes, I was actually gonna. I wonder if we were gonna get around to Tropic Thunder because that's doing an interesting thing. Well, what was your thought about Tropic Thunder?
so much the fact that there is this, as you're talking about this, I'm thinking about, it's there clearly in Hollywood, the joke is out that in order for you to win your Oscar, you've got to take on the role of a person unlike yourself, maybe someone who's had a mental or a physical handicap of some nature, act beyond who you are. And of course, I'm not going to say the words because I'll get crucified here, but Robert Downey Jr.'s character is saying, hey, you went too far in this role. That's the reason why you didn't win your Oscar.
Don't go. Is that like don't go full?
Yeah.
I got
exactly.
You. Yeah.
But then, of course, the whole thing is Robert Downey Jr. himself is going full method. Yep. He's in blackface.
Yep.
And this is coming out of it. Also, previously, he had done another role, which he had taken on the role of a friar or a monk or something like that.
Yeah.
I mean, clearly playing with the idea of method acting and making fun of it, right?
This is something I wish that I had made or found space for this in the book, because I was thinking about this, like a movie that takes the piss out of this tendency of the industry to incentivize that kind of casting. That he's what he plays doesn't he play an Australian? He plays an Australian actor who's trying to win like critical praise, so he then goes
he's
in
the dude playing the dude disguised as another dude.
Yeah. And that's, I mean, to me, that's like, okay, what you were saying, like this is, they are aware of the fact that there's this tendency and they're taking the piss out of it, right? That's part of the joke.
Yeah.
And I guess we then are supposed to, I guess the assumption is we also are aware of that, because we will then, we'll be then on the joke. I mean, they have to be a bit more overt about it than what you get in Tootsie. But I forgot there's the Tom Cruise thing and performing in a problematically Jewish character. Oh my God, there's so much. Tropic Thunder is it's so much going on in that movie, because it's it's the level of awareness. Like if you feel like you can leverage something like that, then you have to feel confident that like it's not just something that's like known by industry insiders, that like the public is to some extent aware of this, even as we may then also reproduce that discourse. Like we are at least aware of it enough to be in on the joke.
Yeah, they took some chances there, but I think we're rewarded for them. And actually, this kind of segues into my next question, which is this: Tropic Thunder clearly influenced or playing perhaps off of Tootsie and maybe Rain Man or some of the other films before it. So I'm kind of wondering if you could speak to the influence of, say, Tootsie onto films that follow it. Does Tootsie have a reach?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that question. I've thought about this. Like you posed this question to me a little while ago, and I've been thinking about it. And I don't know that I can draw any direct influences from Tootsie. I think that maybe if we think about like the later like gender swap films, maybe there's some of that.
There was a film with Ellen Barkin. I forget. What was it?
God. Isn't it just called Switch?
Yes, that's Switch. Yeah, Switch. But that actually plays much more to the sexual nature of the character itself, or character themselves, right?
Yeah. Well, and there's something else interesting about what's happening in Tootsie in terms of like Dustin Hoffman's character's education. Like he's a bit predatory at the beginning, right? Like he's kind of just like in that, using that party to like, he's trying to like bed certain women, right? Even though no one's really falling for it. Like he's not a good guy. Like he's not nice to women, right?
Sleeps with Terry Garr, knowing that she's got a thing for him, but he doesn't for her, and just kind of does. And that becomes part of the plot line, is how do I get out of this?
And yet the film wants us to believe that like the way that sexism in the cultures of media production, in this case in the daytime TV soap show, is that you just need a man's level of aggression in response to the predatory director. It's not until you have Dorothy Michaels kind of employing more of her kind of like Michael Dorsey aggression in response to what Ron Carlyle is doing, that all the women around him are like, oh, I'm so glad someone did that. right? Like I'm so glad people did that. Or when the George Gaines character, I'm forgetting the character's name, but when he's like trying to like make out and, with Dorothy, and she hits him over the head, and, it's like the women are like, oh, thank goodness. Like, it's an interesting message that, like, I guess you just need a women to act more like men to keep men from being men. I don't know. But I think of that because that's something similar in Switch, where that's like the character realizes once they're in Ellen Barkin's skin to like stave off bad male behavior, they just need to be more like quintessentially masculine. I mean, these are all reductive things, but that seems to be the logic that it's kind of leaning on.
There's another film I'm thinking of. Just One of the Guys. Just One of the Guys is I want to say Joyce, the actress's name.
Oh yeah,
in the 1980s.
Joyce Heiser, or something like that.
Yes, this is amongst the Karate Kid-esque kind of films. In fact, has William Zabka as the heavy, as the bad guy in that film.
Yes,
right, and she is pretending to be a guy, just one of the guys in this film.
Yeah,
that's the other one I'm kind of thinking of. It does some different stuff.
Yeah, I mean, so maybe that's part of the influence of Tootsie. I mean, I think one of the things that Tootsie, and by extension, Sydney Pollack's movies, is that they're really like professionally, expertly done. But I don't know that we could identify one or more of them that like initiated some kind of sea change in movies. Maybe Jeremiah Johnson. That might be one. But like, it's not, and it's actually a rare director whose films do that kind of thing, have that kind of like explicit influence. But it's one of those movies that like I feel like when I hear people talk about Tootsie, they talk about it as like a very easy to digest 80s film, right? That like everyone's like really good at what they do. It's really professional. I don't hear about it having a lot of influence. And when I read at the time, as people talked about it being like, this movie is really good, it's really funny, but I didn't detect a sense that like, okay, this is going to usher in some kind of change or what I haven't done is I haven't done a longer reception analysis. So, I mean, it may very well be the case that in the years after that people refer back like, oh yeah, we're thinking about this as Tootsie, or, like there might be that kind of influence. That can entirely be possible. I mean, it did make $177 million.
I think where we see it is discourse on homosexuality on popular audiences, just looking at the way the film is marketed, which is, hey, don't worry, he's not gay, which is really the way the film was marketed. He's doing this thing, but don't worry. And also then you see the way that questions of that are talked about in movies, even like Trading Places is what where you see the way that questions of homosexuality are played for comedic effect. In the case of like the Eddie Murphy films, it's use of derogatory words of slander are used to question someone's manhood or personhood or things like that. So I think maybe you could use aspects of this film to talk about broader themes over time. Right?
Yeah.
Maybe how those change. Because I don't know. Here's the question I want to ask you is, can you make Tootsie in 2023? And if so, how does it change?
I think you can. I mean, I think that one of the things you change is we talked earlier about where Tootsie tries to head off any questions about his character's gender identity or sexual orientation. I think in 2023, I mean, I think you could make a really interesting film where they don't try to head that off, where that character does start to seriously question those things and the kind of norms that they've internalized about what their gender identity means, right? Like maybe it affords their character an opportunity, a window to tap into a part of themselves that they just hadn't been willing to engage with up to that point. You know what I mean? Like it could, I think there's something interesting you could do there. Would it be made like it was in 82? No, I think we both agree that it wouldn't, but like, I think there's something potentially like really transgressive and interesting you could do with having someone kind of take that route as a performer and then realize something about themselves that they actually hadn't reckoned with before. and that could be your more transgressive thing. And I will say this, like if folks are interested in knowing more about Tootsie, obviously read, buy my book, read the chapter. It's interesting.
You still haven't said the name of your book. I'm waiting for you to plug it. Before the Tropic Thunder,
just capture this.
We're going to work on getting it out there.
Just capture this audio, and then you guys can just plug it in randomly, like over the top. So in my book, Imagining the Method, Reception, Identity, and American Screen Performance, I do talk about this. One of the things I use to kind of contextualize this film, there was a book written about the making of Tootsie by Susan Dworkin called The Making of Tootsie. And she's a journalist and had all kinds of behind the scenes access. And then there was a making of documentary shot during the course of production. And that is really illuminating because you see the dynamics between Hoffman and Pollack, and they talk to Terry Garr and Jessica Lange. And you get a sense of like just how, especially with Hoffman, how much he made everything difficult. Everything became an argument. And so he and Pollack, like they said, like literally every day they would have to have an argument over like, okay, what's going on with Dorothy? What are her motivations? Where is Michael in this? And just talking it to death. And, Pollack being the consummate professional he is, was just like, let's, look, we got this on the page. Let's shoot, let's produce. And Hoffman's like, no, we have to argue. Like he would literally be like, we have to argue. That's how the creative process is supposed to work. And I mean, Pollack comes out of a similar tradition and he's just like, no, we just, I'm the director and the producer. We got to make a movie. We can have some of these conversations, but we can't litigate this every single day. Right. Every single day.
It takes too much out of us.
Oh, I mean, he probably, Pollack probably aged, 10 years making this movie. But those
stop
two
being
texts,
the tomato.
Yeah, stop being the tomato. Like, who cares if Tolstoy can walk as he talk or croak as he dies or whatever,
right? Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, you're a fucking tomato. So I, one of the things that I found very helpful in thinking about like the thought process behind that production were those two texts. I found those really, really, really insightful, especially for thinking about how much they labored to insist on his heterosexuality. There's even a couple of moments in the making of that are really, they're really cringy, where Hoffman's like really trying to play up the fact that he's like, don't worry guys, I'm super straight. Like I'm going to pretend to hump one of the workers on the set. And if that would have happened in the last 20 years, his ass would have been fired from that movie, like immediately.
And rightfully so.
Yeah. Yeah. But we get that, to what you were saying earlier, like we get that sense of like just how insistent they are that like, don't worry guys, he's inhabiting this performance, but it's not changing.
Just make believe.
Yeah.
Right.
It's just make believe. It makes him a better person and it helps him understand women, but don't worry. He's still slotted within this like narrow 80s framework of, gender and sexuality. And, you can watch the trailers on YouTube, and the trailers are also insisting on that like, boy, he's proven us all wrong, but he's hopeless. He's still hopelessly straight. Don't get it confused. Don't get it twisted.
As we come near towards the end, do you have a couple of 3 performances by method actors that you really like?
Mm-hmm. Okay. So I cheated here a little bit. I mean, one of the tricky things is that what we consider a method actor, I promise I'm not trying to overthink this, but what we talk about as a method actor is not necessarily the same as like people who were part of the world of method acting. When we think about method acting, generally we're thinking about, to try to simplify things, we think about like method acting is like, that's the dramatic realist approach of like Lee Strasberg. And there are a lot of people doing dramatic realist approaches to performance. And like Strasberg, they were all informed by Konstantin Stanislavski and several others, people like, Sanford Meisner and Stella Adler and Morris Karnofsky and Phoebe Brand and Uta Hagen and a whole bunch of people. But we tend to talk about all of those people as doing method acting, right? So when I was thinking about method actors, I'm going to keep myself to people who spent enough time at the actor's studio that I feel like I can safely consider them method actors. They may not be people who we might classify as method actors, but they they would, in my opinion, qualify. So first one, I think, is a pretty obvious choice. I think this is my favorite film that this person has done. This would be Al Pacino in Dog Day Afternoon. No matter how many times I watch that, I'm so engrossed in his performance. Like, it is just, I feel like we get elements of this elsewhere. And I know Pacino has kind of been, people like to poke fun at his propensity for scenery chewing in later in his career, but it's just so raw. That performance is so raw. And I feel like no matter how many times I watch this movie, that I feel that emotion just pouring out of his character. And I buy into it every time, no matter how many times I've seen it, no matter how much I know what happens next, I'm in it. And of course, it's directed by the fantastic Sidney Lumet, who's also kind of method adjacent. It's got John Cazale, who's kind of one of the great unsung, supporting players of the 70s.
5 movies. Yep. He was in 5 movies.
Yeah.
All of them nominated for Best Picture.
Just incredible. And, just imagine, like, had he not passed from cancer, like what would he have done with the rest of his career? He's so talented. So that would be one. I've already mentioned Paul Newman and Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Not, I think he's pretty widely regarded as a method actor, but you wouldn't think of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid as like a method movie. Again, it's not
a buddy movie.
It's not Cat on a Hot Tin Roof. It's not, it's not something like really moody. But it's just, again, it's just the way in which he makes you believe that he is this character, and the ease with which he appears to do it. Absolutely effortless. Like, he's so charming, and he's playing a bad guy. I mean, like, he's playing a robber. Like, these are not good guys, right? But just the way that he plays off of Redford, like, just, I don't know, the way he moves, it is such an embodied performance that I'm in. I'm just like, again, I could watch that movie and have watched that movie dozens of times, and every time I'm like, I'm in. I know it's Paul Newman, but like, I just so buy into his choices as a performer in that role. The last one is also a bit of a cheat because it's 2 people. One of which, Rod Steiger, is generally regarded as being a method actor, and the other is Sidney Poitier, who also is a method actor, but is generally not received as much. But he studied at the Actors Studio, and it's In the Heat of the Night, which the story itself doesn't necessarily grab me, but man, when those 2 are on screen together, it is absolutely electric. Like, I cannot take my eyes away, and it is some of the best acting I've ever seen with two players together. The way that they kind of dance, like the informal choreography. I mean, just their facial expressions, their body language, even when they're not saying anything, you feel how they're as actors, they're communicating with one another, and it's so good. And I can't even imagine how difficult those performances must be, especially when it's so kind of laden with all of this meaning. I mean, like, these actors know the kind of movie that they're performing in. They know what period of time this movie is being produced in, and to carry it out with that much aplomb. And it's just, I rewatched it last year, and I was just like, it was like I was watching it for the first time. I was like, oh my God, it's like a bolt of lightning hits me when those 2 are on screen together. It is just so, I'm so into it. I'm into it. And, this is not a definitive ranking. Like, there are many other people, but just thinking about the performances that really suck me in and make me I just buy in instantly. Those are 3 films and I guess 4 performances that come to mind for me. But, I'd also recommend, he's not a method actor in the traditional sense, but he is part of that world. John Garfield, like, more folks need to watch John Garfield movies, like Force of Evil. If you're a sports movie person, Body and Soul, one of the best boxing movies ever made. It's incredible. And that's a movie about anti-Black racism and anti-communist witch hunts being made in the midst of like the HUAC era. So it's like, it's so gutsy, and it lands so well for me. And thinking about the fact too that he Garfield did all this amazing work and died before he was 40. Like, especially as I've kind of reached 40, within the last couple of years, it really resonates with me that like the amount of incredible work that he did in such a brief time on this earth.
Yeah, I had that too. Only mine was with Blackbeard the pirate. So maybe
Yeah.
says a lot about our personal ethics. But
I'm curious. Wait, when did Blackbeard pass away? What age?
Blackbeard was 38 when he died.
No. Oh, I guess I assumed he was older.
Well, it's because of depictions on screen, like Ray Stevenson. Oh my gosh, because I'm going to go watch Ahsoka here in a minute.
Oh yes, yeah.
Did you watch Black Sails?
I have not. It's on my queue. I've not gotten around to it.
I am a Black Sails. I will scream about this show as long as I can. It was kind of overwhelmed by Game of Thrones because they were on at the same time. Black Sails is a prequel to Treasure Island.
Oh.
It takes place to talk about the rise of a young guy named John Silver. But talking about, they do not run away from questions over like sexuality, race, all this kind of stuff. It's 4 seasons long. If you get through the first season takes a little bit to introduce everybody.
Yeah.
But holy God, I've watched the entire series 3 times over through now. I cannot do that to Game of Thrones. Black Sails is so endlessly rewatchable. It's phenomenal.
Oh, this is great. This is great. This is going to be.
It's such a study. It's such a and historically, it's not far off the mark. I mean, give or take, because it's talking about the golden age of piracy in 1715. It is, and for me, knowing Florida like I do, a portion of it's set there. It's. I haven't cursed this entire pod. And I'm to tell you, it's fucking great. So that's how much I love it. So
that's so
right,
okay.
Let me get back to you.
Yeah,
go ahead.
That's so great.
Last question here.
Yeah,
because I've had you here now. I was like, yeah, we'll talk for a little while. Tootsie, is it a history movie?
Ooh, this is okay. I love this question. So I'm teaching a film history class right now, and we actually started the class by reading work by historians, not necessarily film historians, about like what does it mean to do history, right? Before we even dive into like what does it mean to do film history, what does it mean to do history? I think if given what we've talked about, if we were to think about this as an artifact of its time, as something that's kind of a mirror reflecting back onto the values of its creators and the values of those who received it in the particular way they did, then I'd say absolutely, and it could be a really useful historical artifact, especially for thinking about like the kind of gender and sexual politics of the 1980s, even in like a cosmopolitan place like New York City. I think it can be useful. I think it would be interesting to consider this within the context of like the Reagan era, the AIDS crisis. What is this like? In what ways is this kind of eliding like the devastating impact of AIDS and HIV on like queer communities in New York City, right? That's, I think against that backdrop, it's interesting, even though this is still the very early 80s. It would be interesting to think about this as like, what is this film's relationship to like representations of history? I think that's really interesting. I don't know how I would answer that exactly. But I think that, if we think about it is this a worthwhile historical artifact to consider? I would say definitely, in no small part, honestly, because it was so successful. Like that had to have meant that it was resonating with people on several levels, right? So, if it had come and gone, maybe not so much. There's a contemporaneous film I talk about, which also kind of focuses on method actors without naming them necessarily, which is called Come Back to the Five and Dime, Jimmy Dean. It's directed by Robert Altman. It has like Cher and Kathy Bates, a very young Kathy Bates, and Sandy Dennis, who is a method actor. And it makes a little bit of money, but it doesn't, it makes like $700,000, right? Like it doesn't cost very much, but it just kind of comes and goes. So trying to make an argument about like the historical significance of that is harder to do than something that is the second highest grossing film of the year, right? Like that I don't want to put too much importance on box office, but that is one of the metrics we have for trying to make sense of like, okay, were a lot of people watching this? Obviously, yes. Can I turn this around and ask you a question?
Sure, absolutely.
Okay. So I mentioned a couple of times this was the second highest grossing film of 1982. Without looking it up, do you want to take a stab at what the highest grossing film of 1982 was? This is a quintessential film for our generation.
E.T.
I'll just say that. Yes, very good. So this film, Tootsie, made $177 million in 1982 dollars. It was number 2 of that year. Number 1 by a mile, twice as much, more than twice as much. E.T. made something
E.T.
around
surpasses Star Wars in 82.
Yeah,
as the highest grossing film of all time.
It was $359 million in 1982 money. Like that's wild. Okay, one other question, because we talked about Gene Hackman. So
Yes.
Did you know Gene Hackman and Dustin Hoffman were roommates as struggling actors in New York?
I do know this. Yes, I'd heard this.
Now, they're both Oscar winners, went on to become Oscar winners. So later, Hoffman, still a struggling actor, ends up rooming with another struggling actor who also goes on to win a Best Actor Oscar. Do you know the name of that actor?
Wasn't it William Hurt?
Not William Hurt.
Who was
but
it?
you are of the same. They are of the same generation, I think. It's Robert Duvall. Robert Duvall.
Okay.
Yeah. So just imagine like Duvall, Hackman, and Hoffman, all struggling actors, like taking whatever, waitering jobs they can to like pay the rent while they're going to auditions and getting rejected. And then like within
Duvall is the subject of my single greatest what if in filmmaking history, which is what if Godfather 3 had done what they had planned to do. If they had paid Robert Duvall to make the film that they wanted to make, which was Michael versus Tom. Give me that film, because we didn't get it. And I don't think that Godfather Part 3 is a necessarily bad film. It obviously doesn't compare to 1 or 2, and it sure as heck doesn't compare to what could have been, because you give me this story of this infighting between two brothers.
Yeah.
Oh God, you give me Michael versus Tom in Godfather 3. Oh gosh, that would have been amazing.
I mean, no disrespect to George Hamilton, but he doesn't have the screen presence of Robert Duvall. He doesn't have that history with from the previous 2 movies. Like he's just, as a stand-in, it's obvious he's a stand-in, and he's not holding his own.
And you know it. You as the audience disconnect from the film because that's not who that should be.
Yep. Yeah.
There's a good movie somewhere in the basic structure of Godfather Part 3. They were trying to do some really interesting stuff, talking about religion, talking about corporations, talking about the corruption of the Catholic Church. Didn't quite land. I can watch it because Andy Garcia is terrific in nearly everything. And so many times I use the GIF from that of just when I thought I was out, pull me back in.
Yeah.
Oh God, you give me Al Pacino, and it's so funny because you talk about Dog Day Afternoon. Actually, we keep going back to Tropic Thunder. One of the characters' name, Al Pacino, right?
Oh, right.
Who turns out to be gay as well, right? So much of that. But you give me Al Pacino with a director, and the last time I've seen Michael Mann with Heat, and even then he's a bit crazy, but 1970s, I don't know that there's anybody better.
It's so good, and it's hard. Like, one of the things that's also working against Godfather Part 3 is it's had all of that, to spend all that time between Godfather Part 2 and Part 3 for expectations to build. Like, oh my God, you've had like arguably the greatest sequel ever made, maybe Empire Strikes Back. But like that's,
I was looking at you. I was like, don't you say it.
Well, and I say this as someone who, Empire Strikes Back is one of my 3 favorite movies ever. But like just thinking about what a sequel can do and how Godfather Part 2 kind of what it does with that is like incredible. And then you wait 15 years, something like that. You have all that anticipation building. Like, that is a hard bar to clear. Even if they had everyone back, they'd have a much better chance. But then removing one of your like 2 or 3 best characters from the jump, like that's really hard to do.
I got to ask you, your 3 favorite films. before we go? I gotta know.
Oh man, this is really going to mark me as a child of the '80s. I think.
That's okay. You are a child of the '80s. That's
Empire,
all right.
Empire. So Empire Strikes Back is probably my number one.
Okay.
I would say Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. I don't even think it's the best of the films. It's just the one.
And Raiders is the best of the three.
Raiders is the best, but there's something about
Raiders is a perfect film.
Yeah, there's something about Last Crusade where it's something about the dynamic. Yeah, the dynamic between Ford and Connery that I just I think it's landed more with me since I've become a dad. That I'm like, there's a lot there, and there's something about the way. Again, I keep coming back to this, but like when you see great actors play off of each other, and there's something about the way that the things that Connery elicits in Ford that Ford just doesn't get to do in any of the other movies. And I don't know, they bring out something in each other that I'm like, it's really good. And it's also, it's the funniest of all of them. And it's, and to my mind, it's also the most sincere. So I think that resonates with me, a lot. And I think the last one would probably be, it might be Sunset Boulevard. I've watched that movie so many times, and I never cease to be amazed at how unforgiving it is about kind of how Hollywood treats its laborers as disposable. And like, this is Billy Wilder, like, he's been working in the industry for quite a while, and there's so many meta elements to it, where actors are portraying characters that are really close to like their own experience. Like, I love the fact that we have the Waxworks, and it's, people like Buster Keaton who, like didn't really survive the transition to sound. I love how cynical it is about Hollywood, because I think sometimes that's needed, to puncture the myths that Hollywood likes to sell about itself. I mean, we get a lot of that now, that's very common, like, especially when we see, the more we learn about the actors strike and the writers strike, and just how like terrible the studios are to the people that actually make the content that draw us to the theaters and to TV screens. But for this to happen in, the middle of the 20th century, when we still have the studio system, is to me like, it's not only a great film, it's also just incredibly like gutsy. And so I keep coming back to that. So, it'll change. I think my top three changes every few months, but that's kind of where I'm at right now. I don't know if I've heard you say what your top three are.
So it's funny. I get ecstatic because I keep random numbers. Like, I can tell you like my 1 through 11 favorite films, right? I'll say this is my number. Like, Dirty Dancing is my number 7 favorite film of all time. Which I've got a pod coming up on that soon, because
ooh, nice.
I have seen Dirty Dancing so many times. Okay, so I tend to take the easy way out and say Star Wars, Empire, and Jedi as a single film, just like I do Raiders, Temple, and Crusade, right? But if I'm going to be accurate, my single favorite film that I watched more in the last few years than any other in the last 20 years is a documentary. It's called Riding Giants. It's about the history of big wave surfing. It's directed by Stacy Peralta, and it is phenomenal. And it's set in 3 different vignettes. Riding Giants. It is, in my mind, the greatest single greatest documentary ever made. It's also my favorite film ever made. It is phenomenal. It follows the history of big wave surfing. And you introduced by three guys. One is Greg Knoll, and it follows him in Hawaii in the 1950s and 60s, and talks about the culture of big wave surfing and how it ebbs and flows with the culture. And then shifts to California, following a guy by the name of Jeff Clark and the discovery of this massive wave outside of San Francisco, outside of Half Moon Bay, called Mavericks. And then the third portion follows Laird Hamilton and his creation of, or popularization of, a thing called toe-in surfing out near Piahi, which is off of Oahu, off of Maui, I'm sorry, and so forth. And it's phenomenal. And that film actually got me over my fear of flying, because Laird Hamilton actually makes this amazing ride off of this wave off the coast of Tahiti called Chopu. And later on, he's talking to his dad. And his dad asked me, he's like, you could have died. And his dad's this famous surfer too, named Billy Hamilton. And he says, why do you do this? And Leonard Hamilton just says, he's just like, I don't want to not live because I'm afraid of what could happen. And when I heard that, I was like, oh, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So taking this job out here in Colorado, pushing on with HATM, things like that, confronting fear. I'm like, I don't want to not live because I'm afraid of what could happen. Right.
Right.
So that's my number one.
Yeah.
Number
that's
two.
Great. Yeah.
Oh, I love it. I highly suggest it. We haven't done it on HATM yet. We haven't really done documentaries. It's not really what we do. But I love the film, but highly suggest it to anyone who wants to listen. Number two is actually Singles.
Oh, yeah.
By Cameron Crowe. Comes out in 1992. Talking about a film that I've rewatched more and more. Single greatest soundtrack of all time. I love it. Campbell Scott was born on my birthday 10 years prior. I grew up in Kentucky in the 80s, and Kentucky and Louisiana, and enter high school in 1991, 92. And my entire life, I wondered what would happen if I were 10 years older and living in Seattle. I just feel like I missed the boat. I'm just missed it. Oh God. And I had an episode where like the whole thing, if you know this film, when Steve and Linda break up and are they going to come back together, and they're away for a part. Oh man. And then finally Star Wars, and specifically Empire Strikes Back. Right. And that's always going to be the cinema favorite, but the films I watch more often than anything else, probably Riding Giants and Singles. Coming right in after Star Wars is Raiders of the Lost Ark, and the initial trilogy. And then somewhere along the lines of Heat, Goodfellas, LA Confidential, Dirty Dancing, somewhere in that group is probably that's where they all kind of go. So that's the general list right now.
That's really good. I should be better at coming up with lists. I mean, I'm really bad at it. Actually, I'm really bad at it. I should it's also just a really nice thought exercise to think about like what you watch and what you like and why. I need to do that. Yeah,
exactly. What are the commonalities here? Where's the diversity? Like, I'll start picking. Why don't I like more things that? Okay, I don't like musicals and I don't like things about Indiana. Okay, so I've never seen A Christmas Story because it's in Indiana.
Oh well, but okay, but think about it this way: none of it was shot in Indiana. It was shot in Cleveland and in St. Catharines, Ontario. So like,
doesn't matter.
And it's it is set in a fictional, essentially a glorified suburb of Chicago, right? Like northwestern Indiana. It's basically Chicago. They call Coke pop. They're not like the rest of us in the state. There's a difference north of I-70, south of I-70. North of I-70 they call it pop. South of I-70 they call all soft drinks Coke. So it gets really confusing when like my parents went to Europe and they were asking everyone for Coke, and people were like, okay, they bring a Pepsi and be like, no, we want a Coke. And they're like, okay, well, it's just a linguistic thing, but. Yeah.
My stance on that's well known at this point in time. So, yeah. The long running Coke versus Pepsi war. So, all right. Justin, where can people find you on the social media stratosphere? You've got a book coming out.
I do have a book coming out. Yeah. So my book is Imagining the Method. It's coming out in January 2024 with University of Texas Press. I'm really excited about it. It's been a 10-year long project, 13 different archives across the U.S. I lost track of how many primary documents, many, many thousands. You can find me on Twitter at J_O_Rawlins. I think that's my same ID on Blue Sky. Who knows how long Twitter will remain, or X, or whatever long that's going to remain. But they can look for me there, and I hope people will take an interest in the book. It spans a lot. We go from early late 19th century like camp cultures to all the way up to 21st century AI, and you get to see a really cool image of Marlon Brando experimenting with a digital avatar. So I have some really cool scans of his face where it's like stretched out. It's very, very cool. Yeah. So thank you so much, Jason, for having me on. This has really been wonderful.
I hope you come back on I hope you come back on so we can get you back on before the book comes out or right as the book comes out, because I think we've got a list of films that we can do.
There's a lot. Yeah, there's a lot of cool stuff we could talk about. Other stuff that we didn't even get to cover here, and I didn't get to talk about the craziest Jared Leto stuff. Like, I mean, his behavior is so outrageous. I got to include words in my book that I'm pretty sure don't show up in any other academic book that's ever been written. So, but I can get away with it because it's stuff that he did. So, and it's part of the book. So, whatever you want. Like, let's do this again, and we can even talk a little bit more about noodling.
We'll do some method noodling. We'll come back and we'll do a fight. It'll be fun.
We could do this from like a creek bed. Yeah, that would be awesome.
And that's a wrap here at Historians of the Movies podcast. Thank you so much again to our guest, Justin Rawlins. Thank you, Justin, for stopping in and talking. This was such a fun, awesome conversation. I really, really enjoyed it. For those of you guys who want to learn more about Justin's work, he's got a book coming up again being released in January. It's called Imagining the Method: Reception, Identity, and American Screen Performance. It's coming out through University of Texas Press. It'll be available in January. And we're going to do another podcast with Justin before the book comes out, mostly to hang out with Justin because he's such an awesome, astute, just such a smart dude. And I just love talking to the guy today. And I hope you guys enjoyed the pod. Thank you, of course, to our intrepid producer, Fletcher Powell. You can find him on Twitter at Fletcher_Powell. And other various places, and we could not make this show without Fletch. So thank you, Fletch, for being here. I hope you dug the pod today and have minimal notes for me later on. And of course, thank you to everybody here for joining in today. Thank you for continuing to share the pod. It means a lot to me that you guys continue to come back. The pod numbers continue to grow week after week, and it's only because you guys are continuing to share this on Twitter, on the other social media platforms, and word of mouth. So thank you for continuing to be such amazing advocates for this thing. Keep tuning in. We got some more great pods coming for you in the next coming weeks. And that's about it for now. So we'll talk to you a little bit later. Ciao for now. Bye.